So, what if the single most powerful economic institution in America was actually the source of our biggest financial problems? Well, that's the provocative case made in Ron Paul's very influential book, End the Fed. Today, we're going to dive in and break down its core arguments to really understand this pretty radical idea.
The book kicks off by pointing out something that feels really obvious, but when you stop and think about it, it's actually pretty profound. We think about money all the time, right? Earning it, spending it. But how often do we actually stop and ask, what is this stuff? Where does it come from? This simple question is really the rabbit hole that the whole book jumps down.
And that really tees up the central question the book tries to answer. And its conclusion points the finger directly at one of the most powerful and, let's be honest, least understood institutions in the entire world, the Federal Reserve.
Okay, so the first major argument in End the Fed is that the money system managed by the Fed creates what the author calls an illusion of wealth. So what does that even mean? Let's unpack it.
The book argues that the Fed has this unique, almost magical power. It can essentially create money out of thin air. Now, this isn't about giant printing presses running 24/7. It's a bit more complex. It's done by buying government debt and setting interest rates, which then injects brand new money into the banking system. And that core mechanism is exactly what the author puts under the microscope.
The book actually uses this quote from President Obama to really drive the point home. The argument here is that the economic booms we experience, especially when they're fueled by all this newly created money, aren't always real. They're like a mirage of prosperity that eventually has to vanish.
So how did an institution with this much power even come to exist? I mean, where did it come from? The book argues that its creation wasn't some public necessity, but was actually a plan hatched in secret by some of the most powerful bankers of the time.
Okay, so the story, according to the book, really gets going with the panic of 1907. The big banks were spooked and they wanted a safety net, a so-called lender of last resort that could bail them out in a crisis. This all led to a super-secret meeting in 1910, which laid the blueprint for the Federal Reserve Act that was passed just 3 years later.
And the book puts a huge emphasis on who was in that room. It was this mix of top government officials and senior partners from the absolute biggest banking dynasties of the day. We're talking Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and Kuhn Loeb interests. The claim is that they all went down to this private island, worked for a week in total secrecy, and drafted the blueprint for America's entire future financial system. So the Fed is now established, and this is where the book really shifts gears and puts the institution on trial, laying out a whole series of charges for its performance over the last century.
Charge number one, and this is probably the one that hits home for most people, is the claim that the Fed has systematically destroyed the value of our money through a relentless policy of inflation.
And the book puts a number on it that's, well, it's pretty shocking. It claims that since the Fed was created back in 1913, 95 cents of every dollar's purchasing power has just been erased. Think about it. What you could buy for a single dollar back then now costs you over $20.
And check out this table from the book. It really illustrates the point. It shows the US dollar losing value right alongside other major paper currencies. But the critical comparison, according to the author, is that last column, gold. Because gold is a commodity that's outside the control of any central bank, the data here suggests it actually increased in real value over that exact same period.
All right, charge number 2 is a direct shot at the Fed's whole reason for existing. The book argues that, far from creating stability, the Fed is actually the primary cause of the destructive boom and bust cycles that just seem to plague our economy.
I mean, remember, the Fed was created with the promise of ending financial panics. But the book argues, if you just look at the historical record, it tells a totally different story. It points to a whole century of recessions, including the Great Depression itself. The core argument here is that by manipulating interest rates, the Fed doesn't prevent crises, it actually creates the artificial booms that make these painful busts totally inevitable.
And for the ultimate example of this contradiction, the book points directly to former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan. As a young theorist back in 1966, he wrote passionately against central banking and in favor of a gold standard. But then, fast forward a few decades, and he's the one at the helm, wielding what he himself called the inordinate power of the very system he had once condemned. The book's critique doesn't just stop with the economy, either. It expands its case to make another pretty startling claim, that the Federal Reserve is an absolutely essential tool for funding modern large-scale warfare.
Citing the economist Ludwig von Mises, the book argues that before central banking, wars had to be funded through direct taxation. Money people could actually see leaving their pockets. And people would only put up with that for so long.
But with the ability to create money, a government can fund conflicts far beyond what its citizens would ever willingly pay for, basically hiding the true cost through inflation.
So after laying out this whole case against the Federal Reserve, from inflation to business cycles to funding wars, the book arrives at its final and completely uncompromising conclusion.
It's not about reforming the Fed or auditing the Fed or just changing its leadership. No, the book's proposed solution is right there in the title: a complete and total abolition of the central bank.
The book really presents this as a kind of silver bullet. The argument is that by getting rid of the Fed, you simultaneously solve all the problems it supposedly creates. You stop the devaluation of money, you stop the artificial business cycles, and you take away the state's unlimited credit card that it uses to fund endless wars and massive debt.
Ultimately, the book frames this whole thing as an issue of freedom. And it leaves us, the readers, with a really challenging final question. If the Federal Reserve were to just disappear tomorrow, what would take its place? What does an economy built on truly sound money actually look like? Well, that is the debate this book was written to start.